What would you do if a quiet man on a plane stood up for you once and somehow ended up changing everything you thought you had to carry alone? Rachel Bennett didn't believe in fate, but she remembered the exact moment her life shifted. Not when her mother died last week, not when she became a single mum 5 years ago. It happened somewhere over the Midwest, 32 minutes after takeoff in seat 22B on a packed evening flight from Denver to New York. She was returning from her mother's funeral with a suitcase full of folded grief and a daughter curled asleep beside her. 5-year-old Lily, with her stuffed penguin tucked under one arm, had dozed off before the plane even lifted into the sky. The man beside Rachel hadn't said much. He wore a dark hoodie, kept his posture still, his eyes forward. Not indifferent, just watchful. There was a quiet strength about him, but Rachel hadn't thought twice. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, and she was used to doing things on her own. Then came the voice, 2 rows behind her. Low, smug, the kind of tone that crawled under your skin. "Bet you'd be warmer without that jacket," the man said. "Why don't you take it off, sweetheart? Why don't you take it off, sweetheart?" Rachel froze. The words weren't loud, but they slid down her spine like cold oil. She didn't turn around, didn't respond. Another comment followed, closer this time, then a hand, fingertips grazing the back of her seat, creeping in her direction. She sat up straighter. "Please don't touch me," she said firmly, her voice even. A mocking laugh came from behind, and that's when the man next to her moved. Not suddenly, not violently. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt and stood smooth, calm like someone trained not to hesitate. Not violently. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt and stood smooth, calm like someone trained not to hesitate. Rachel barely had time to process, but the way he positioned himself slightly ahead of her, angled, steady, told her one thing. This wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. The man behind them raised both hands with a smirk. "Hey, easy, man." Just talking. Just talking. "You need to stop," the stranger beside Rachel said quietly. Row 22 fell silent. It wasn't the volume of his voice. It was the way he said it, like the words had been carved out of stone. "I said back off." The smirk behind them faded. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The stranger tilted his head, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Then, "I'm the last person you want to test at 30,000 feet. Then, I'm the last person you want to test at 30,000 feet. That was it. A flight attendant appeared a moment later. Passengers whispered, "Passengers." Within minutes, the man behind them was escorted to the rear of the plane, swearing under his breath. Within minutes, the man behind them was escorted to the rear of the plane, swearing under his breath. The stranger sat back down. No victory grin, no nod, just silence. Rachel turned to him slowly, her heart still pounding. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He nodded once. "You're welcome. You're welcome." Now she looked at him properly, strong jaw, eyes sharp, scanning the cabin. Hands relaxed, but ready. There was something about the way he sat, like a man who'd seen too much, but never stopped being alert. "I'm Rachel," she offered, breath still unsteady. "Jack," he said, no last name, no questions. Just Jack. She didn't know it yet, but Jack Callahan, the man who had just stood up for her, wouldn't just change her evening. He'd change the course of her life. The cabin settled again into its steady hum. Rachel sat quietly, one hand resting on Lily's blanket-covered shoulder. The little girl hadn't stirred through any of it, still breathing in that rhythmic, innocent way only children can. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she tucked the blanket higher. Jack hadn't moved much since sitting back down. His shoulders were still squared, gaze forward, body poised. "Do things like that happen often?" she asked quietly. He turned his head just slightly. "Too often." There was calm in his voice, not detached, measured. Like someone who had spent years learning how to stay still when others unraveled. "I meant what I said," he added. That kind of thing shouldn't happen to anyone. That kind of thing shouldn't happen to anyone. Rachel let out a long breath and leaned back into her seat. She hadn't realized how tight her body had been since the moment she boarded. You don't look like someone who works in tech, she said after a pause. That earned her the slightest twitch of a smile. Why's that? Just a guess, she shrugged. You didn't hesitate. The way you stood up, it felt familiar. Like muscle memory. Jack was quiet for a moment. Military, he said finally. She looked at him again. The posture, the eyes, the stillness. It all clicked. Army, Navy, Navy, Air Force, he replied. Then, after a pause, retired, sort of. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Sort of. Sort of. He glanced down at his hands for a second. Still do some work, let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that. She nodded. She knew that tone, the one that meant, don't ask more than I'm ready to give. She knew that tone, the one that meant, don't ask more than I'm ready to give. The cabin lights dimmed to amber. Rachel folded her arms and stared ahead. I didn't expect this flight to be the scariest part of my week. Jack turned toward her, voice low. Rough trip? My mother's funeral. He nodded once. No awkward platitudes. No shallow sympathy. Just, I'm sorry. Rachel appreciated that more than he knew. What about you? She asked. What brings you east? What brings you east? Work. Mostly. Mostly. He didn't elaborate. And strangely, she didn't need him to. They sat in a companionable silence after that, the kind that only forms between two people who don't need to explain what they've survived. Lily shifted slightly, murmuring in her sleep. Rachel brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead and kissed the top of her head. Jack's eyes lingered on the little girl. She your only one? Rachel nodded. Lily, 5 years old. Somehow older than me on most days. Jack gave a faint smile. She's lucky. Rachel chuckled softly. You gathered all that from watching me try not to fall apart in seat 22B. You gathered all that from watching me try not to fall apart in seat 22B? No, he said. From how fast you stood your ground. From how fast you stood your ground. Rachel turned toward the window. Not because she was embarrassed, but because those words landed closer than she expected. Outside, snow had begun to streak across the night sky, swirling in soft chaos against the glass. And inside, for the first time in years, Rachel Bennett didn't feel like she was carrying everything alone. The plane hummed softly under their feet, a muted lullaby of altitude and engines. Rachel watched the clouds drift by the window, her thoughts foggy and restless. Jack Callahan sat beside her, the man who had stood up without hesitation, not just against a harasser, but against the weight of silence. Lily was still asleep, her small body pressed into Rachel's side, stuffed penguin tucked safely under one arm. Rachel spoke without turning. You didn't even blink. Jack didn't respond at first. Then, in a voice that was low but steady, you learn to move before the damage is done. Then in a voice that was low but steady, you learn to move before the damage is done. It didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded lived. It sounded lived. Rachel turned slightly to look at him. That sounds like something you've had to do before. That sounds like something you've had to do before. He nodded once. There's a cost to waiting. The words hung there, not dramatic, just honest. They fell into a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. As if two people who'd both learned how to carry weight quietly had recognized something in each other. Rachel glanced down at her daughter, then back up at Jack. You have kids? Jack shook his head. No, just deployments. Just deployments. The way he said it, like a man listing off losses he didn't care to name, made her stomach tighten. Sorry, she said quickly. That was personal. That was personal. He shrugged, not offended. It's a fair question. People assume guys like me have a wife, a dog, a mailbox in some quiet suburb. She smiled faintly. Do you? Do you? No wife, no dog. Haven't had a mailbox in a while. He said it lightly, but Rachel heard something else behind the words. Distance, disconnection. You always live out of a duffel bag? Jack smirked just a little. These days, it's carry on only. These days, it's carry on only. Rachel laughed softly, the kind of laugh that slips out when grief loosens its grip for just a second. Jack looked at her not with pity, but with the kind of attention most people forget how to give. You travel a lot? She asked. Not by choice, he replied. Sometimes I just end up where I'm needed. Sometimes I just end up where I'm needed. And tonight, that happened to be 22A? He looked at her. Apparently. There was another pause, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things neither of them had the energy to explain and didn't need to. Rachel reached for the airline napkin in her seat pocket and wiped her eyes. Sorry, I'm not usually this weepy. Jack leaned back in his seat. You just buried your mom. You get a pass. Rachel nodded. Then, she raised me alone. I think that's why I've been trying so hard not to fall apart in front of Lily. Jack tilted his head slightly. How's that working for you? How's that working for you? She gave a breathy laugh. It's not. It's not. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer advice. He just let the truth hang in the space between them. You ever lose someone? She asked, after a long moment. Jack's jaw shifted slightly. Yeah. He didn't elaborate. Rachel didn't push. But then, after a pause, he said quietly, her name was Nadia. Rachel turned to him gently. Friend? Friend? Jack nodded once. She was an interpreter. Afghanistan. Brilliant. Fearless. Younger than she should have been for what she had to carry. What happened? Rachel asked, softer now. There was intel, Jack said slowly. A threat. We waited for confirmation. Standard protocol. But it came too late. He looked down at his hands. She didn't make it. Rachel felt something ache in her chest. I'm sorry. Jack gave a slow nod. So am I. So am I. The stillness returned. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was reverent. As if the cabin itself knew not to interrupt what had been shared. As if the cabin itself knew not to interrupt what had been shared. She sounds like someone who mattered, Rachel whispered. She was. After a long moment, she spoke again. You said earlier that waiting has a cost. Jack looked at her. Yeah. She nodded thoughtfully. You didn't wait today. You didn't wait today. No, he said. I didn't. She looked down at Lily, still breathing deeply, her small hand wrapped around Rachel's wrist. I think I've been waiting a long time, Rachel said quietly, to stop feeling like I'm on my own. To stop feeling like I'm on my own. Jack didn't respond right away. Then he said something that caught her completely off guard. You're not anymore. Rachel turned her head. His voice hadn't wavered. He wasn't offering her a fairy tale or a rescue plan, just presence, the simplest, most unexpected kind of comfort. Outside, snow streaked past the window like time itself, rushing by. Inside, two people who had never planned to meet began to lean not fully, not foolishly, but gently into the strange possibility that connection could still happen after everything. I'm not great at this, Rachel said after a while. Letting people in. Letting people in. Jack smiled faintly. Then we're even. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time that day, she let herself believe something might still begin. Even now. Even here. At 30,000 feet. The captain's voice broke the quiet cabin with a soft crackle. Ladies and gentlemen, due to worsening weather systems over the East Coast and limited airspace clearance into New York, We've made an unscheduled landing at McKenzie Regional Airport in Nebraska. We'll be refueling and awaiting further instruction. We appreciate your patience. A collective groan swept through the plane. Passengers reached for phones, checked the time, whispered their frustrations. Rachel closed her eyes. Nebraska? In a snowstorm? She felt the weight of everything catching up to her grief, exhaustion, a 5-year-old asleep on her lap, and a suitcase full of memories she didn't want to unpack. In a snowstorm? She felt the weight of everything catching up to her grief, exhaustion, a 5-year-old asleep on her lap, and a suitcase full of memories she didn't want to unpack. Hey! Jack's voice cut through the rising tension around her calm, quiet, grounding. Breathe. One thing at a time. One thing at a time. Rachel opened her eyes. He was looking at her, not with pity, but presence. Like someone who wasn't asking her to be okay, just reminding her she didn't have to carry it all alone. You always this calm during storms? She asked, half smiling. Jack leaned back in his seat. No, I've just been through worse ones. I've just been through worse ones. Moments later, the plane came to a full stop. With the option to deplane into the small terminal, passengers began filing out. Rachel hesitated. Lily was still fast asleep, her small form limp with complete trust. Before Rachel could adjust the blanket or reach for her bag, Jack was already standing. I've got it, he said, lifting her carry-on gently without asking. Rachel blinked, but didn't argue. Outside, the air was sharp and freezing. Inside the terminal, it smelled faintly of instant coffee and tired bodies. Fold-out chairs lined the walls. A flickering vending machine hummed near the end of the corridor. Jack led the way to a corner where the lights were dim and the air was a little warmer. Rachel settled in, Lily still curled in her arms. Rachel settled in, Lily still curled in her arms. She'll be out for a while, Rachel whispered, brushing Lily's hair from her face. Jack nodded, scanning the room with subtle eyes. Not the worst place I've been stuck. Not the worst place I've been stuck. Rachel followed his gaze. But definitely not the best. But definitely not the best. No, he agreed. But at least here, no one's shooting at us. But at least here, no one's shooting at us. She gave him a sideways glance. Was that a joke? Was that a joke? He shrugged. Not really. Not really. Silence returned, but not the heavy kind. This was something else, the quiet that settles between two people who know how to wait, how to be still when the world insists on rushing. You said you're still active? Rachel asked. Consulting, Jack replied, mostly off the record. I train teams, advise, handle sensitive assets. She raised an eyebrow. You make it sound like you're in a spy movie. You make it sound like you're in a spy movie. His expression didn't change. Sometimes it feels that way. Sometimes it feels that way. Before Rachel could ask more, a woman in an airport staff jacket approached with a clipboard and a kind voice. Sorry to interrupt. We're assigning hotel vouchers for families with young children. There's limited space, so we're prioritizing single parents. Rachel blinked, unsure whether to speak. That's us, Jack said before she could find her voice. The woman glanced between them, scribbled something down, and walked off. Rachel turned toward him, wide-eyed. You didn't have to. I know, Jack said. But it's past midnight. You haven't slept, and you're not dragging a 5-year-old through more paperwork. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. Then nodded. Thank you. But this time it wasn't just about the room. The hotel wasn't much, just a roadside stop with beige walls and thin carpet. But it was warm. And it was quiet. They were given a room with 2 queen beds. Rachel tucked Lily into one, then stood by the window for a long minute, unsure what to do next. Rachel tucked Lily into one, then stood by the window for a long minute, unsure what to do next. Jack set her suitcase in the corner and stepped back toward the second bed. I can take the floor if that makes it easier, he said. She shook her head. It's fine, you've done enough. You've done enough. Jack didn't argue. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring quietly at the floor. There was a soft golden glow from the bedside lamp, the hum of the heater, the breath of a sleeping child, and two people who hadn't expected to share this night, yet somehow belonged to it. You always step in like that? Rachel asked softly. With strangers on planes? With strangers on planes? Jack thought for a moment. No, he said. Only when I know what silence can cost. Only when I know what silence can cost. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. She didn't need to. She just watched him, the quiet posture, the steady hands, the weight behind his stillness. He didn't look like someone running from something. He looked like someone who had already stopped. Outside, snow fell in soft, swirling sheets beneath a flickering parking lot lamp. Inside, Rachel sat cross-legged on her bed, facing Jack across the space between them. Lily slept peacefully, one arm flung across her stuffed penguin like she was guarding treasure. Rachel spoke first. You said silence has a cost. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't fill the space with noise. He didn't fill the space with noise. He just sat there, quiet, like a man sifting through drawers of memory to find the one he was willing to show. Then finally, her name was Nadia. Rachel stayed still. She was a local interpreter, Jack said. In Cairo, smart, braver than most of us. There was a threat. We hesitated, waited for confirmation. Followed protocol. He looked up at Rachel, eyes steady. She didn't make it. Rachel's chest tightened. I'm sorry, she whispered. Jack nodded. So am I. So am I. He leaned back against the headboard, his voice quieter now. That's why I don't wait anymore. When I see someone afraid to speak, I don't sit still. When I see someone afraid to speak, I don't sit still. Rachel nodded slowly. She didn't just hear his words, she understood them. She didn't just hear his words, she understood them. Not just the loss, but the shift that happens inside you afterward. That silent vow you make in your bones. The room was quiet. Outside the motel window, the snow had turned to a soft drizzle of frozen rain, pattering gently against the glass. The heater kicked on with a low hum. Lily stirred once in her sleep, then settled again, her cheek pressed into the stuffed penguin's head. Jack sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped loosely between his knees, staring ahead, not at anything in particular, just somewhere far away. Rachel leaned back against the headboard of her own bed, legs pulled up under her, blanket draped around her shoulders, like armor she didn't know she was still wearing. You loved her, she said quietly. Jack didn't answer right away. Then, with a breath that sounded like it came from somewhere deep inside his chest, he said, I respected her. Rachel waited. She'd learned not to fill silence with noise. Sometimes silence was what a story needed in order to find its way out. Nadia wasn't supposed to be there that day, Jack continued, his voice low, steady. She switched shifts with another interpreter. We got intel about an ambush. I saw the signs. But I waited. Wanted confirmation. Wanted it in writing. Chain of command. His jaw flexed once. By the time we moved, it was too late. Rachel sat with the weight of his words, not as an outsider, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry regret that never slept. Not as an outsider, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry regret that never slept. She trusted me, Jack said. And I let her down. And I let her down. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. He didn't need to. The pain was there, not raw, but deep, settled, the way grief ages when you've lived with it long enough. I know what that kind of silence feels like, Rachel said after a long pause. Not the quiet around you, the one inside. Jack looked at her. When Lily was born, she continued, I didn't know if I could do it. My mom was already sick. Her father, He left before she took her first breath. Jack didn't react. No surprise, no judgment, just listening. I think he loved the idea of being a dad, she said, a soft, bitter smile tugging at her lips. But not the job itself. But not the job itself. Rachel turned her gaze toward the sleeping form of her daughter. I stayed. Took care of Mom, worked 2 jobs, didn't go anywhere. Didn't date, didn't breathe, really, just held it all together. She looked back at Jack. I thought that was strength. I thought that was strength. It is, he said without hesitation. Rachel blinked. You're still standing, he added. That counts for something. That counts for something. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She looked down at her lap, blinked quickly. She looked down at her lap, blinked quickly. Jack stood quietly and crossed to the motel's mini-fridge. He pulled out 2 small water bottles, handed one to her. He pulled out 2 small water bottles, handed one to her. Hydration helps, he said with a half smile. Rachel laughed, softly but real. Is that military wisdom? Is that military wisdom? No, he said. That's just what people say when they're too afraid to hand someone a tissue. That's just what people say when they're too afraid to hand someone a tissue. She shook her head, smiling now. Then took the water. Then took the water. I don't usually talk to strangers like this, she admitted. Jack sat back down on the edge of his bed, water untouched in his hand. I don't usually spend snowstorms in Nebraska hotel rooms with single moms and stuffed penguins. So we're even, he smiled. A quiet, subtle thing, but it stayed longer this time. For a while they said nothing. The kind of nothing that wasn't empty, it was full. Of grief, of stories, of things unspoken but understood. Rachel stared at the ceiling. I used to think people showed up in your life with big gestures, she murmured. Romantic speeches, grand entrances. But lately, I think it's more about who stays, who sees the mess and doesn't flinch. Jack turned toward her, his voice softer now. I flinched a lot. Just not on the outside. Rachel looked at him. You don't seem like someone who runs. You don't seem like someone who runs. I don't. He paused. But I disappear sometimes. Not out of fear, just habit. She nodded. I know what that feels like. I know what that feels like. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing snow against the window pane in soft hisses. Inside, warmth settled not just in the room, but in the space between 2 people who hadn't planned to be in each other's lives, but now couldn't imagine this night without the other. Inside, warmth settled not just in the room, but in the space between 2 people who hadn't planned to be in each other's lives, but now couldn't imagine this night without the other. Jack broke the silence. You're doing a good job, you know. Rachel looked over. With what? With what? Everything, he said, raising her, holding yourself together, surviving. She exhaled a shaky breath. Most days I don't feel like I'm doing anything well. Most days I don't feel like I'm doing anything well. That's how you know you are. Rachel looked at him like he'd just said something she hadn't realized she needed to hear until now. A small knock came at the door. It was a hotel staffer with a paper bag, a couple of sandwiches, juice boxes, 2 bottles of apple cider. Midnight courtesy for snowed-in travelers. Jack took the bag with a nod of thanks. He passed one of the sandwiches to Rachel and sat on the floor near the foot of the bed, his back against the wall, eating slowly like a man who had eaten dozens of these in a dozen different countries, never expecting warmth, just calories. Rachel joined him on the floor. Not because she had to, because sitting beside him felt easier than sitting alone. Do you ever stop feeling guilty? She asked after a while. Jack was quiet. Then, no. But you learn how to carry it without letting it carry you. She nodded slowly. That sounds like something that took you a long time to learn. That sounds like something that took you a long time to learn. It did. They sat there, 2 quiet souls in a roadside hotel room in Nebraska, sharing cheap sandwiches, and the kind of truths that most people spend years avoiding. And in that strange, snow-covered pause from the world, Rachel felt something shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a little lighter. The morning came quietly. Outside the motel, the snow had softened into thick drifts, blanketing the sidewalks and parking lot in peaceful white. Street lamps flickered against a pale grey sky, and the world felt hushed like it had paused to catch its breath. Street lamps flickered against a pale grey sky, and the world felt hushed like it had paused to catch its breath. Inside the room, the warmth from the heater mixed with the faint scent of instant coffee and fabric softener. Rachel sat at the edge of the bed, brushing Lily's hair as the little girl yawned, still clinging to her penguin. Rachel sat at the edge of the bed, brushing Lily's hair as the little girl yawned, still clinging to her penguin. Jack stood by the window, already dressed, his bag slung over his shoulder. His hoodie was zipped high, his posture quiet, but ready the same way he'd sat beside her on the plane. He hadn't said much since they woke up. His hoodie was zipped high, his posture quiet but ready the same way he'd sat beside her on the plane. He hadn't said much since they woke up. Neither had she. Not out of awkwardness, but because something about this part of the story felt fragile. Temporary. Temporary. Like they both knew it was about to end, and neither one wanted to press too hard on the goodbye. Lily looked up at Jack and smiled. "Are you coming on the plane too?" Jack crouched beside her. "Not this time, sweetheart, but I'm glad I got to share a snowstorm with you." She giggled and hugged her penguin tighter. Rachel watched them, her chest tightening in ways she couldn't explain or maybe didn't want to. They boarded the shuttle back to the airport together. Jack carried the suitcase without being asked, and Rachel didn't try to stop him. Lily fell asleep on her shoulder again before they even left the parking lot. On the short flight back to New York, Jack didn't sit beside them. Different row, different boarding group. Somehow that felt fitting. Different boarding group, somehow that felt fitting. Rachel stared out the window most of the way, the hum of the plane almost comforting now. Every so often, she'd glance back. Jack was there still, composed, eyes forward like always. When the wheels hit the runway at JFK, something inside her dipped. She didn't want this to be the end. But what do you say to someone who stepped into your life just long enough to make you feel less alone, then left with the same quiet he arrived? At baggage claim, Rachel reached for her suitcase while Lily held Jack's hand, casually, like they'd done it 100 times before. That image, her daughter's small hand in his, trusting, stopped Rachel in her tracks. Jack noticed, gently released Lily's hand, and gave Rachel a nod. "She's a strong kid. She gets it from her grandmother," Rachel replied, her voice tight. They stood there in the blur of people collecting luggage, in that strange space between strangers and something more. "Well," Rachel said finally, her voice thin, "thanks for everything. Thanks for everything." Jack looked at her. "Really? Really?" She met his eyes. "Really? Really?" A beat of silence passed. "You need a ride?" he asked. She shook her head. "No." "A friend's picking us up." Jack nodded. Okay. Rachel reached out and offered her hand. He shook it firm, warm, steady. "You take care of yourself," she said. "You too." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like a man trained to move quietly, without leaving a trail. Rachel stood still, holding Lily's hand now, watching him go. Lily looked up at her. "Will we see him again? Will we see him again?" Rachel didn't answer right away. "I don't know, baby," she said softly. "I really don't. I really don't." 3 days passed. Rachel returned to the rhythm of her life: early mornings, school lunches, long shifts at the clinic. The routine wrapped around her like an old coat. Familiar, worn, necessary. But something felt different. different, not wrong. Just quieter, just quieter. She caught herself looking for Jack in passing crowds, pausing when a hoodie moved the way his did, listening for that voice, calm, even, anchored. He had taken up residence in her thoughts in a way she hadn't expected or invited. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Rachel sat at her laptop. She stared at the blank search bar for a long time before typing, Jack Callahan, Air Force. Interpreter, Cairo. At first, nothing. Then, a press release 6 years old with a blurry photo of a man who looked a little too much like him. Colonel Jack Callahan, commended for leadership during a classified recovery mission overseas. Details redacted. No interviews, no headlines. Just a few dry sentences, scrubbed of emotion. Rachel sat back in her chair, heart racing. He hadn't told her any of that. Not the rank, not the recognition, not the recognition. She thought of him standing in the motel room, offering water and silence instead of sympathy, of the way he stepped in without hesitation, of how he'd looked at Lily like she was more than a passenger on a snowed-in night. She closed the laptop slowly. There had been something real in those moments, not fantasy, not rescue, just presence, and now he was gone. The next morning, the doorbell rang at 8 o'clock a.m. Rachel wasn't expecting anyone. She peeked through the peephole. It was him. Jack stood on her front step, hands in his pockets. No uniform, no armor in his eyes, just Jack. She opened the door slowly. I had some leave time stored up, he said. Thought I'd use it. Rachel blinked. How did you? He held up his phone. Your address was on the luggage tag. I wrote it down. Just in case. There was no smugness in his voice. No drama. Just truth. Simple, careful, honest. No drama. Just truth. Simple, careful, honest. He reached into his jacket. Also, your daughter left something behind on the plane. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Rachel opened it. 3 stick figures, hand-drawn in crayon. One was clearly Lily. The smallest figure held a penguin. The tallest had short hair and a grey square that looked like a backpack. All 3 figures were holding hands. The smallest figure held a penguin. The tallest had short hair and a grey square that looked like a backpack. All 3 figures were holding hands. She looked up. Jack hadn't moved. Rachel stepped aside, holding the door open. Come in. Rachel poured hot water into 2 mugs. The kettle hissed behind her, releasing little clouds of steam that curled like ghostly questions into the kitchen air. Jack sat on the couch in her living room, still wearing that same hoodie, his hands resting on his knees as he looked around quietly. Jack sat on the couch in her living room, still wearing that same hoodie, his hands resting on his knees as he looked around quietly. The place was warm, lived in. Family photos lined a nearby shelf. Rachel as a little girl with her mother. Rachel holding a newborn Lily, one frame slightly cracked, but still displayed with care. Lived in. Family photos lined a nearby shelf. Rachel as a little girl with her mother. Rachel holding a newborn Lily, one frame slightly cracked, but still displayed with care. She handed him a mug. Chamomile. It's all I've got. Jack took it with a small nod. I've had worse. He didn't look out of place, even with the crayon-colored stick figure drawing of himself still taped to the fridge behind him. That was the strange thing. He didn't fit in, he belonged. Rachel sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own cup. I still can't believe you showed up. Jack didn't smile. He just said, I wasn't sure I would. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. She didn't know what she was searching for in his face. Maybe regret, maybe hesitation. But what she saw was something quieter, a man who had stopped running. "Why now?" she asked softly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded drawing Lily had made. "I saw this again the other night," he said, "and I realized I wasn't finished here. Rachel looked at the picture again. 3 stick figures, holding hands. Simple, childlike, unmistakably real. She let out a slow breath. Lily doesn't let people in easily. Jack's eyes softened. I noticed. There was a long pause, filled only by the ticking clock in the hallway. Then came the knock. Rachel frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. She set down her mug and opened the door. A man in a dark suit stood there, tall, well-groomed, badge clipped discreetly to his belt. His eyes scanned past Rachel, landing squarely on Jack. "Colonel Callahan," the man said. Rachel froze. Jack stood slowly, his entire posture changing, shoulders squared, voice calm. Jack stood slowly, his entire posture changing, shoulders squared, voice calm. "I told command I was on leave." "I'm not here for command," the man said. "I'm here because of the Cairo file. Jack didn't blink. "That file is sealed." "Not anymore." Rachel looked from one man to the other. "What's going on?" Jack turned to her, voice lower now. "It's nothing." "Just a formality." The man interrupted. "You're not under investigation, Colonel, but we need to ask you a few questions." "Now!" Jack let out a slow breath, then turned to Rachel again. "I'm sorry." He stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind him. Rachel stood frozen in place, the untouched mug still steaming on the table. Lily looked up from her drawing. "Where did Jack go?" Lily looked up from her drawing. "Where did Jack go?" Rachel swallowed the knot in her throat. He had to take care of something. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Rachel sat alone on the couch. The apartment felt different. Still warm, still hers, but missing something. She opened her laptop, typed slowly. Jack Callahan Cairo file. Most of the results were vague. Sanitized. But buried in the archives of a military blog, she found a headline. Classified mission in Cairo, sparks quiet controversy. Civilian casualty rumors surface. No names. No details. But one sentence stood out. No details. But one sentence stood out. Sources suggest a decorated U.S. officer temporarily withdrew from active duty following a decision that cost the wrong person their life. Officer temporarily withdrew from active duty following a decision that cost the wrong person their life. Rachel leaned back, heart heavy. He had been talking about Cairo, about her Nadia. When he said silence has a cost, it wasn't metaphor. It was memory. The next day passed without a word. No message, no knock at the door. Rachel debated texting him. Typed something out, deleted it. Instead, she stood outside Lily's room that evening, watching her daughter sleep. On the wall above the bed was the same drawing. 3 stick figures, still taped in place. On the wall above the bed was the same drawing. 3 stick figures, still taped in place. She wondered if he remembered it. She wondered if he thought they'd taken it down. They hadn't, and part of her hoped he'd come back to see it still there. It was Thursday morning, just after sunrise. The street outside was quiet, dusted with a light frost. Rachel stepped outside to take out the trash, still in her robe, coffee half forgotten on the kitchen counter. Rachel stepped outside to take out the trash, still in her robe, coffee half forgotten on the kitchen counter. And there he was. Jack stood at the bottom of the stairs. Same hoodie, same stillness. But something in his face had changed. Not worn down, just done running. Rachel didn't speak. Neither did he. Then softly, Jack said, I shouldn't have left the way I did. She stayed still, one hand on the railing. I thought I was protecting you, he said. Keeping my past out of your life. Keeping my past out of your life. Rachel tilted her head slightly. And now? And now? Jack took a slow step forward. Now I know. Maybe you weren't the one who needed protecting. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Rachel asked, "What happened in Cairo?" Jack looked down. A breath, then another. "There was a building," he began. "A threat we knew about. We were told to wait for visual confirmation. When we moved in, there was a child. We didn't see her until it was too late." Rachel's breath caught. Jack's voice didn't shake, but his eyes, they held every second of that memory. "That's the thing about command," he said. "You live with decisions no one else remembers. But you never forget." Rachel opened the door wider. "Come in." He hesitated. "Are you sure? Are you sure?" She nodded. "You're not the only one who's had to live with ghosts. You're not the only one who's had to live with ghosts." Jack stepped inside, his boots silent against the floor. The door clicked softly behind him, like something finally settling into place. The door clicked softly behind him, like something finally settling into place. He looked around the apartment like he didn't know whether to sit or keep standing at attention. Rachel watched him. He wasn't the man who had simply stood up for her on a plane. He wasn't even the man who'd helped carry her daughter through a Nebraska snowstorm. He wasn't the man who had simply stood up for her on a plane. He wasn't even the man who'd helped carry her daughter through a Nebraska snowstorm. He looked stripped down, honest, human. "You didn't have to come back," she said. "I know," Jack replied, but not coming back felt worse. But not coming back felt worse. He stepped toward the table and placed something down. His wallet. From it, he pulled a thin military ID, green, sharp, official. Colonel Jack Callahan, United States Air Force. "I figured it was time you saw it," he said. Rachel stared at the card, then up at him. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Jack met her eyes. "Because I didn't want to be that guy on the plane." The uniform, the title, the weight. "I wanted to be someone you looked at and didn't flinch." Rachel took a deep breath. "I never flinched, Jack. I just didn't know. I just didn't know." He nodded once. From the hallway, the sound of soft footsteps. Lily, still in pajamas, rubbing her eyes, her penguin dangling from one arm. She blinked up at Jack, then smiled. "You came back." Jack knelt, smiling back. "I said I would. I said I would." She wrapped her arms around his neck without hesitation. Rachel's heart clenched not from fear, but from the aching sweetness of something that felt so real, it hurt. Rachel's heart clenched not from fear, but from the aching sweetness of something that felt so real, it hurt. When Jack stood, Rachel gestured to the kitchen. "Come on, I'll make coffee. I'll make coffee." Later, as the sun stretched its fingers across the apartment walls, the three of them sat at the small kitchen table, mugs in hand, the room warm with quiet understanding. Rachel looked at him. "So, what happens now?" Jack didn't answer right away. He looked around at Lily's drawing still taped to the fridge, at the cereal bowl on the counter, at Rachel sitting there with both hands wrapped around a chipped mug. He looked around at Lily's drawing still taped to the fridge, at the cereal bowl on the counter, at Rachel sitting there with both hands wrapped around a chipped mug. "That depends on you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" Jack looked down for a second, then back at her. His voice was steady. "I've spent most of my life being sent somewhere, to a mission. A war, a problem someone needed solved, but this," he nodded toward the home around him. "This isn't a mission. I don't want to be here because I saved you on a plane, Rachel. I want to be here because I'm choosing it." Rachel's eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. Jack continued, his voice softer now. This is the first thing in a long time that feels real. She reached out not with a promise, not with certainty, but with something quieter, more honest. Her hand, palm up. Jack placed his over it. Not a rescue. Not an answer. Not an answer. Just a beginning. Fall gave way to early winter. The city dimmed earlier now. Lights flickered on before dinner, and the sidewalks filled with the hush of scarves, mittens, and the quiet crunch of leaves under tired feet. Lights flickered on before dinner, and the sidewalks filled with the hush of scarves, mittens, and the quiet crunch of leaves under tired feet. Inside Rachel's apartment, life found a rhythm again. Not perfect. Not choreographed, but real. Not choreographed, but real. Jack came by most evenings, sometimes after sessions at the base, still in his boots and hoodie. Other times, in quiet clothes that blended in, like he didn't want attention, just presence. Other times in quiet clothes that blended in, like he didn't want attention, just presence. Lily always ran to the door first. "Did you bring cookies?" she'd ask, or stories, or both. Sometimes he brought one, sometimes neither, sometimes neither. But what he always brought was the same thing. He showed up. Rachel started leaving the porch light on before he even texted. She never said why. He never asked. One Friday afternoon, the clinic where Rachel worked held a community event, free screenings, flu shots, warm meals for those who needed them. Rachel hadn't expected Jack to come. Crowds weren't his thing. Too many eyes, too many exits to track. But as she handed out forms near the front desk, she looked up. And there he was. Civilian clothes. Standing beside Lily, who was gripping his hand with one and waving at her with the other. Standing beside Lily, who was gripping his hand with one and waving at her with the other. Rachel's heart caught. After the event, once Lily had been tucked into bed, she and Jack sat outside on the fire escape with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Steam rose from their mugs. The city blinked and hummed below them, distant, harmless. The city blinked and hummed below them, distant, harmless. "Today meant something to you," Jack said. Rachel nodded slowly. "It always does. It always does." Jack looked out across the skyline. "You make it look easy." She smiled. "It's not. It's not." "I know," he said. "That's why it's beautiful. That's why it's beautiful." There was a long pause. A kind one. A kind one. Then Jack reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. No fanfare. No speech. No speech, just a folded piece of paper. Rachel took it carefully, opened it. A formal letter, stamped, signed. Signed. His discharge papers, honorable. Immediate. Immediate. She looked up at him, confused. "What is this?" "I'm done," Jack said. "With deployments, with disappearing. With living a life where everything is temporary except regret." Rachel blinked. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. Jack continued, quieter now. "I've served long enough to know what matters, and for the first time, I want to serve something I chose. And for the first time, I want to serve something I chose." He looked straight at her. "I choose this." Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "I never asked you to give it all up," she whispered. "I know," he said. "But I want to, because for once I'm not answering a call sign." He reached for her hand. "I'm answering you." Rachel closed her eyes, let the warmth of his words settle into her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to do it all herself. A few weeks later, they took Lily to the park. She raced through piles of golden leaves while Jack and Rachel sat on the bench, sipping coffee from paper cups. "She's drawing you into everything now," Rachel said, amused. "I noticed," Jack replied. Apparently I'm a superhero and a dinosaur in the same picture. Apparently I'm a superhero and a dinosaur in the same picture. Rachel laughed, leaning into his shoulder. And in that moment, Jack didn't look like a man weighed down by a uniform or a file marked Cairo or years of ghosts. He looked like someone who had finally arrived, not at a place, but at a life. Winter came slowly, not with blizzards or ice, but with quiet, the kind that settles into the corners of your life without fanfare. Lights stayed on longer. Gloves became routine. Breath turned visible on morning sidewalks. Inside Rachel's apartment, things had shifted, but not in a way anyone else would notice. The change wasn't loud. It was in the details. Jack now had a hook by the door where he hung his coat. He knew which cabinet held Lily's favorite cereal. He stopped knocking, and Rachel had stopped waiting for him to leave. Some nights were chaotic. Lily with a fever, dishes piling up, Rachel exhausted from a double shift. Jack didn't fix those nights. He was just there, washing the dishes beside her, carrying Lily to bed, listening. There was comfort in that kind of quiet consistency, like a song that never needed to crescendo to be beautiful. One evening, after dinner, Rachel found Jack sitting at the kitchen table. Lily was asleep. A worn folder sat in front of him. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "That looks official." "That looks official." Jack nodded. "It is. It is." He slid it toward her. Inside were his final clearance documents, his permanent discharge from all remaining consultative work. No more classified assignments. No more unexpected calls. No more halfway in, halfway out. "I thought you already left," Rachel said, surprised. "I did," Jack replied. "Mostly. But there was still a foot in the door. Still people who could call and I'd go." "And now?" Jack looked at her, steady. "Now, I go nowhere unless it's with you." Rachel felt a warmth rise in her chest so deep it caught her off guard. She sat down slowly. "You're sure?" He reached across the table, took her hand. "I've spent years walking away from people, from places, from anything that made me feel still." He paused. "But this?" He nodded toward the apartment, the drawing still pinned on the fridge, the silence that had finally become something gentle, not lonely. "This is where I stopped running." Rachel didn't speak for a moment. Then she squeezed his hand. "I used to think I needed someone strong," she said, "but what I really needed was someone who stays. But what I really needed was someone who stays." Jack nodded. "Then I'm exactly where I should be. Then I'm exactly where I should be." 1 year later, Rachel stood in the back of a small school auditorium. The room smelled of crayons, winter coats, and hot chocolate in foam cups. Children in paper graduation caps wiggled on the stage. Lily stood in the center, beaming, holding a certificate with glitter stars and her name written in crooked marker. When her class was called, she ran straight into Jack's arms. He spun her around once, laughing. He wasn't in uniform, he didn't need to be. He was exactly what he had chosen to become, someone who showed up. Rachel walked over. Lily reached for her other hand. The three of them stood beneath a string of paper stars taped to the auditorium wall. And in that moment, Rachel understood what she hadn't on that flight a year ago. Sometimes the hero isn't the one who arrives, it's the one who stays. The holidays came with quiet magic. Not the kind wrapped in ribbons or strung across rooftops, but the softer kind, the smell of cinnamon in a warm kitchen, the flicker of fairy lights against window glass, the sound of laughter over puzzles on the living room floor. Rachel had never been big on celebrations. For years, it had just been her, Lily, and her mother making the best of what they had. But this year felt different. Not because the tree was bigger or the gifts more elaborate, because someone else was there to help carry the weight. Jack didn't try to take over. He showed up to wrap presents when Lily was asleep. He put too much whipped cream in the hot chocolate. He fixed the blinking strand of lights on the porch without being asked, and more than once, Rachel caught him just standing still watching her and Lily with a quiet reverence, like he didn't want to miss a single moment of the ordinary. One snowy evening, they sat together on the couch. Lily had fallen asleep between them, head resting on Jack's lap, a picture book still open on her chest. Rachel sipped tea, blanket pulled up to her chin. "She doesn't ask about her dad anymore," she said quietly. Jack looked down at Lily. "She doesn't need to. She doesn't need to." Rachel turned toward him. "Neither do I. Neither do I." It wasn't a declaration. It was a truth that had unfolded quietly over time, a shift from surviving to living, from doing it all alone to not having to. Jack brushed a strand of hair from Lily's forehead, then looked at Rachel. "I used to think love was about sacrifice," he said. "Giving everything, burning yourself out for something you believed in." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think it's about staying, about being there when it's boring, when it's hard, when no one's watching. About being there when it's boring, when it's hard, when no one's watching." Rachel nodded. "That's the part no one writes stories about. That's the part no one writes stories about." Jack gave her a small smile. "Maybe they should. Maybe they should." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, snow fell in soft spirals beneath the porch light she always left on. Outside, snow fell in soft spirals beneath the porch light she always left on. Weeks later, Jack stood in the kitchen one Saturday morning, making pancakes with Lily. Rachel sat at the table pretending to read the paper while really just watching. The batter sizzled. Lily laughed as Jack flipped a pancake too high and caught it mid-air with exaggerated flair. Lily laughed as Jack flipped a pancake too high and caught it mid-air with exaggerated flair. Rachel had seen him in so many versions of himself, the soldier, the protector, the man weighed down by memory. But this version in her kitchen, in socked feet and a flour-smudged shirt, singing along softly to a classic rock station, this was the one she loved most, the one who stayed. Later that afternoon, Jack stood on the balcony, looking out over the city. Rachel joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Rachel joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Some parts," he said. "But not enough to leave. But not enough to leave." She rested her chin against his shoulder. "You ever think you'll go back? You ever think you'll go back?" Jack turned to her, voice firm but gentle. "No. Because for the first time, there's nowhere else I'd rather be. Because for the first time, there's nowhere else I'd rather be." Rachel pulled him closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard." Jack smiled. "No," he said. "The bravest thing I've ever done was sit next to a woman on a plane and let her change everything. The bravest thing I've ever done was sit next to a woman on a plane and let her change everything." They stood there for a while, wrapped in stillness, wrapped in each other. The world below moved as it always had, loud, uncertain, fast. But up here, in the space they'd built together, time felt different. It felt like it belonged to them. Sometimes, the quietest kind of love is the one that stays. We live in a world that often celebrates the dramatic, the grand gestures, the loud declarations, the heroic rescues. But for many of us, especially as we grow older, we come to understand that what truly matters isn't who shows up once, but who keeps showing up. Rachel spent years carrying the weight of life alone, a mother, a daughter, a quiet fighter. Jack carried his own burdens, regret, silence, a past filled with orders and sacrifice. But in each other, they didn't find rescue, they found rest. This story reminds us that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like someone pouring your tea, fixing a loose light bulb, sitting beside you when the world goes quiet. And in that stillness, something powerful happens. We heal, because healing rarely comes all at once. It comes slowly through presence, through patience, through the simple, quiet act of staying. And perhaps in the end, that's the bravest thing any of us can do.